Or even yeah. Or what I was about to say that, or we'll wonder why we're in the state the country's in, and then even bother to show up. Again, Winston Churchill's right. What did he say? The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Right? What's wrong with the country? Have you been to class in 10 weeks? No. Well, that's probably part of it. You can't even. Yeah. Winston Churchill. Those British guys, they're one for quips. Those British guys, they're one for quips. All right, so what we're talking about today is, and again, like I said, I wish we'd already been recording, when we were talking about the Aristotelian view and even up through classical philosophy about forms of government and which would be the best, but at the same time, which offers or which can be the most perverted in the sense of becoming the most dangerous. And then also because how do we say that related? Oh yeah, because we were talking about virtue theory and how that was similar to the better the virtue, the more dangerous the perversion of that virtue, right? Even your textbook points out something like this when they talk about, because your textbook, what they do is they try to say that how can virtues be good when, say, mob bosses can use them, right? Like that serious sense of loyalty and honesty and sacrifice among, say, the mafia within the group. And they say, well, wait a minute, how can these things be good if they can be used in such a way? Right. So, but the point is that, well, wait a minute, the classical philosophers would argue that, well, that's the point. The better the virtue, the more dangerous the perversion of said virtue or whatever. But again, anyway, that's kind of way down the line from where we are right now. So what we're going to do is talk about natural law theory. Now, here's the weird thing. Here's the paradox about natural law theory as it pertains to an ethical theory. It's the easiest, it's the 100% easiest to understand in one sense. Because if natural law theory is right, you're all already aware of it, and you all are already using it in regards to your moral decisions. Now, here's the catch. It's almost the most difficult to explain and comprehend in another sense, because it relies so heavily on philosophical abstraction and a prior commitment to, well, not even necessarily explicitly committed to, even if it's just implicit, but a prior commitment to metaphysics and a certain ontology. Now, how do I say that without violating the law of non-contradiction, right? Because wait a minute, how can you say it's the hardest and the easiest? Because if it's the hardest, it's not the easiest, but it's the easiest, not the hardest, right? Right. Because we mean it in what? A different sense, right? We're using that word, those terms analogously there. So in one way, it's easy because you all are already, if the theory itself is true, you're all already using it in some way. You all already assume it in some way. But then when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of explaining it, that's where it really gets difficult, because it relies so heavily on, again, a prior commitment to, whether explicit or implicit, to a certain metaphysical position. Now, let's go ahead and clear up the first most often misunderstanding of natural law theory. So, natural law theory, we're talking about ethics, right? Is this a prescriptive ethic or a descriptive ethic?
Which one?
This natural law theory, is it prescriptive or descriptive? So far, give me a hint, we've only had one that's descriptive, and that's really not even proper, because that would be moral relativism, right? So natural law theory, if it's a real ethical theory, it's what kind of ethic? Right, it's prescriptive, if it works, right? If it works, right, how you ought to act, right? It's an ought, which is prescriptive or normative. Sometimes I don't even know if we've said this yet. Normative, it's a normative ethical theory, meaning that's how you ought to behave. prescriptive, normative, all natural law theory. So this theory, and this is, you're going to see why it's fallen on hard times as of late, even though it's made a resurgence among many philosophers. It's made a resurgence, but again, you'll see why, culturally speaking, and overall, it's still on quote unquote hard times, is that of this prior metaphysical commitment. Now, again, so let's get back to what the first difficulty or the most common misunderstanding is in regards to natural law theory. When we say that natural law, what do you think we're making reference to there? This is the most often kind of common misunderstanding. What do you think we're making reference to when we say natural law? In a way, that's closer to probably to the right definition of it, though. What's that, Piper? Right. So most people hear nature and they think, well, that which is just natural, right? Like nature of some sort. So expand on that. What do you mean by that? When you say like nature, what do you mean by nature?
It's the way things are accepted.
Right. So you look at something in nature, right?
Say, oh, that's the way it is.
Right. That's the way it is. Or natural law, like say physics or something like that, right? Or physical sciences. Huh? Well, maybe not necessarily question it, but misidentifying it. So, and it'll become clear when I say this right here. So when they say natural, they're not talking about that. What do you think they're talking about? What do you think the natural is supposed, if the natural is not talking about just looking around and seeing, you know, whatever happens in nature is right, what do you think the natural is actually speaking of? And this is, again, one of the most often misunderstood aspects of natural law theory. They're actually talking about not nature in that sense, but natures in this sense. And nature meaning what? The essence of something. So what do you think I mean when I say that? You guys know. What do you think it means to say that? What do you think it means to say the essence of something? In what sense? Some sort of, in a physical sense, or what do you mean at its core? Right, the philosophical sense. So like the essence of something. Give me an example of that. Maybe in a sentence if you can. Like what if someone said, well, man, that's just the essence of what it means to be a dog, dude. Why are you surprised the dog did that? That's the essence of what it is to be a dog. Say the dog is, you know, taking a slam on your carpet or whatever. And somebody says, why are you mad at the dog? That's just what dogs do. That's just part of the essence of what it means to be a dog. Right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? So you use this word a lot, right? You use it in that sense all the time, right? Or you'll say essentially, blah, 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 blah. You're trying to get at the core, like Piper said, the core, the essence of what that thing is. Does that make sense? Now, the old school word for that, and these are interchangeable to a certain extent, is the nature of something, right? So you could say the same thing. It's just the nature of what a dog is, right? It's like when somebody does something and you're like, who I feel like it's my nature. Yeah, I mean, that's how people use it in the common vernacular a lot, but really, that's parallel to what we're talking about, because it's not just talking about, you know, leaves and gravity or whatever else, but it's really, but again, even that's not really the heart of what we're saying, because that would be wrong, right? So if some guy says, I'm a killer, that's just my nature, we'd be like, no, that's not your nature, right? You mean that in a different sense than what these guys are talking about. So here's the other thing, and we'll get to this. The formal cause of something. So the nature of something, say the nature of what it means to be a human being. Like all of you have human nature. If classical law theory is right, all of you have what's called human nature. It's part of your nature to be human. It's part of your essence to be human. Another way is your form is human. Again, that's not to say the shape you're in, right? It's not, again, we're not talking about just physical stuff here. We're talking about the formal aspect of what you are, your nature, your essence is human, right? You're not something else, right? Does that make sense? So this right here would mean this right here, this formal cause, your formal cause, you have a material cause, right? Again, this talks about the prior metaphysical commitment. You're made up of matter, right? Like Piper is made up of matter. You're all made up of matter, right? But why is Hannah not Piper if they both have a human nature? So the argument would be something like, well, because she's composed of different matter than he is, right? So what makes them the same? What makes them the same kind of thing? Huh? Right, they're made of different matter. But here's the problem. What makes them the same then? What makes them both human? Like, what do they have in common? Huh? Yeah, they have problems. Well, so if natural law theory is right, the thing they have in common is what? The same thing that all of you have one thing in common in this room is what is, if natural law theory is right. You all have what? Same essence, the same nature. All of you share human nature.
I'm not the only person here that likes starting fires.
Right. Hey, we've got a bunch of crap going on with fires. You better watch out. So if natural law theory is right, all of you guys share human nature, right? But you're not the same thing because you're different matter, right? You're different people, but what is it that makes you all, what is it that you all have in common? Same nature or essence, right? Same with this desk. Like all of these desks, in one sense, are identical, right? Look at them. I mean, they're identical. But how? So what makes these the same? Is that really all they have in common? Because I mean, technically speaking, I could make that out of glass, right, and just paint it, right, to make it look like that. It wouldn't have to be made out of the same thing, right? But what makes why are these all what do these share in common? Right, they would say this. The same formal cause. They all have the same formal cause. They all have the same I don't want to say necessarily nature, because this is what they would call accidental, or made accidental in the sense it's made by people. It's an artifact, as I should say. But they all have that formal cause. What unifies them? They all have the same formal cause. Well, then what makes them different? If they're all exactly the same, then what makes them different? They all have a different what? Material cause. They're made of different matter, right? This desk is not made out of the same stuff that is. Why? Because it's over here, right? This stuff is made out of this stuff over here, right? Now, natural law theory says that everything, most specifically everything that's not, an artifact, meaning man-made, artificial artifact, has a nature or an essence to it. Does that make sense? Everything has a nature and essence. There's a such thing they would say as dogness, right? Or catness, or humanness, right? Or waterness, like the nature or essence of it. So you've got, this is just the nature of water. This is why it does what it does, right? This is why when you get wet, this is why these things happen, because that's the essence of what water does. Does that make sense? That's part of the essence of it. Now, natural law theory, and again, this is a big misunderstanding, is people say, well, how do you know all this stuff? Well, again, this is the quote unquote, we're back to the easy part. They would say you're built, your mind. Remember how we talked very early in the semester that your mind is made to work logically, whether you know it or not? That's why you wipe after you take a slam, right? Or that's why you go to the refrigerator when you get hungry, not, when you're not, right? Because your mind is working logically, whether you know it or not, right? That's why you take a shower after you get dirty, as opposed to taking a shower and then rolling around the dirt and then going to sleep, right? Because your mind is constructing what? What do we call these in logic? Syllogisms, right? All those that take showers are clean. I'll take a shower, therefore I'll be clean, right? Your mind does that, whether you don't even know it. It just does that. It's made to be that way, right? So here's, again, the easy part of natural law theory. Even though, remember, when you didn't know anything about logic or syllogisms, when you sat in this room in here and you learned about it, the quote unquote easy part was that your mind was already doing it, right? Again, how do we know? Well, because all those examples we gave, you do these things prior to this, or you act in such a way, you're already doing that. You know it already, quote unquote, right? You know it somehow. You're, lack of better words, built, constructed to work that way, even though you didn't explicitly what? Even though you didn't explicitly what? Right. Even though you didn't, in one way, know what logic was and syllogisms were. You were doing them, right? You were just doing that. You were living in such a way because your mind was just made to work that way. Now, the natural law theory guys, if they're right, they would say, this is exactly the same with this kind of stuff right here, with natures and essences. Meaning that they would say, when you look at something over and over and over and over again, when you observe the world around you, you're able to, they would say what? Abstract, pull out. You're able to pull out, like with your intellect, with your mind, the nature of that thing. Does that make sense? Let me give you an example. Again, I hate having to give, things made by humans because sometimes it's a little tricky. Again, and the philosophical jargon there would be called artifacts. But like my little boys too. Now, has he seen every truck that exists? Clearly not, right? I mean, he just hasn't. I mean, I haven't seen every truck that exists, right? But we're driving down the road the other day, and he sees his toy trucks, right? His little toy trucks, and he's seen some real trucks or whatever. But they're always a different color, right? They're always a different shape. One may be a real size, one may be a toy, Well, the other day we're driving down the road. Well, he sees one that he's never seen before. Obviously, it's a different color than the other ones that he's played with or that he's seen or whatever. It's a different size. It's not exactly the same. But he recognizes what? He says, look, Daddy, a truck. And he's 2. Now, what has he done? The natural law theorist would say what? He's abstracted what it means to be what? The truckness, right? So even though he hasn't seen every truck, how does he know that that's one of them? Because it doesn't look identical to the others, right? It may be a different color. It may be a different size. It may be a different shape. It may be life scale. It may be but how can he possibly know that? Unless he's what? His intellect is able to what? Abstract what? The essence of a truck, right? So that he has seen enough trucks, his mind is able to grasp, again, quote unquote, truckness, so that when he sees one, he can recognize it. Does that make sense? Same thing with a dog. Same kid, same boy, my son. He hasn't seen every dog, right? Some look, we know how radically different dogs can look, right? Especially in this day of, breeding and all that kind of stuff. Well, he sees one, he says, look, a dog. Well, but he hasn't seen that dog. And he hasn't seen a dog that's exactly like that dog. But how did he know that that was what? A dog. He's abstracted that, quote unquote, is what they would say. He's abstracted the essence or nature with his intellect of dogness, of what it means to be a dog. Now, here's where natural law theory makes the next step. So that's your prior metaphysical commitment. Your prior metaphysical commitment is that human beings are able to pull out the nature of things after repeated observation, repeated observation, repeated observation. And those can be better, or those can be closer to the real nature of things, or worse than the real, right? So, just like with anything else, you can make mistakes at times, right? But over time, if you're really pulling out the nature, the essence of a thing, then natural law theory would be right. Does that make sense? Because you're seeing what the essence of the thing is. Now, here's where they turn it into an ethical theory. How do you think they're going to turn this into an ethical theory? How do you think they're going to turn this into an ethical theory?
As long as you act by your nature, it's okay.
What's that?
As long as you act within your nature, it's okay.
I mean, you're almost there. I mean, you're falling a little short of the goal, but you're almost there. You're on the right track.
Don't do drugs.
Drink milk. They would say this. They would say what? If you can abstract the nature of things, you know, after repeated observation, what we called induction earlier in epistemology. If you can abstract the nature of things, then what can you start to figure out? Again, with your intellect, with the mind. Not necessarily. Why do you know that a car should not be driven at the bottom of the English Channel? Why do you know that that would be bad for the car? Why do you know? I don't know how that follows, but why do you know that it would be bad, quote unquote, for a car to drive at the bottom of the English Channel, say your car? Huh? It can't do it. Why can't it do it? Right. It's not. What is it? A car. So build on that. It's not what? The nature of a car to what? To drive on the bottom of the ocean, right? Because what? You've abstracted what the cars what? Do. Like what their end goal is. See, this is your next metaphysical commitment. That they have a true what? Telos, which is a purpose or a, and again, formal cause, this would be what? Final cause. And when we say final cause, we mean what? It's purpose. It's telos. It's end goal. It's end goal. This is what cars, they have a telos, right? They have a purpose. And so the natural law theorists would say that this is ultimately the cause of all of these things. That there's some purpose that needs to be had, which instantiates and puts into motion a material cause, which are first what instantiates and puts into motion the efficient cause, which would be the person or the thing that brings the thing into existence. Then the material cause, which would be the material it's made out of. Then the nature or the essence of the formal cause would be why it's that thing and not something else. Like when you said it's a car, not a submarine. Well, why is it not a submarine? Because its essence is not that. That's not what it is. It's something else. The final cause, what? That got the whole ball rolling to begin with, the purpose of the thing to begin with, right? So do you remember the other day? Oh, well, let me say this first, and we'll get back to that cultural hot button example. They would say, after observation, looking at the nature, if your mind, remember, they're banking on the fact that you're already doing this. That if you're abstracting the natures of things, you're abstracting the essences of things, and you're pulling these natures and you're abstracting these things out of real things that exist. You knew without anybody having to tell you that you can't drive your car on the bottom of the English Channel, because that's not what cars are what? Right. All right, whatever. So you know that they can't do that, right? Because you've observed, you've abstracted the nature or essence of a car, right? No one has had to tell you that, right? Now, a 1-year-old might not know that yet, right? They haven't observed that long enough. They haven't abstracted fully the full nature of a car. You have. Now, here's where it turns into an ethical theory. Here's the key here. Because remember, they want to say that this is based on reason and logic just as much as any other ethical theory. Natural law theorists are going to say that what? That morality or ethics are what? Two. Non-reasonable or reasonable? Completely reasonable, right? So they would say, when you've abstracted the nature and the essence of the thing, whether you want to admit it or not, you know what that thing was made to do. Does that make sense? And so here's the catch. So if you do something contra to this, the final cause, the end goal, the telos, the purpose, then what have you done? Something wrong. Does that make sense?
So you're going to relate that with.
Does that make sense? So you remember the other day when we talked about how Plato, Socrates, and those guys, remember the controversial statement we talked about the other day, or were some of you not even here yet? Because we kind of did that early. Remember we said if you look at what Plato said, what? If you look at it out of context, you think Plato and the classical philosophical position, those guys are what? Bigots, right? And antiquated in their argument. But really, why was he saying what he said? What did he say? Does anybody remember? Remember, he said homosexuality was like what? What did he say? Like eating dirt. Now, if that's taken out of its context, what would people say in our culture? That that's bigoted, right? Or that's antiquated, or there was no reason at all to even say something like that. What argument do you? You didn't even give an. But remember, if Plato's right, if natural law theory is right, you see what he's saying now. Why? Why is he saying that? Because, right, so let's look at something like the digestive system first, right? So he would say, if the digestive system, if the human being, if the very essence of what it means to be a human being in regards to the digestive system is to looking at it, observing it, abstracting the nature and the essence of a digestive system, if the nature and the essence of a digestive system just is to what? Right, pull out, extract nutrients, extract nutrition, extract protein, all these sorts of things, and then produce, quote unquote, in effect, for the furtherment of the body. If that just is the essence of a digestive system, then what would be wrong for that? To eat dirt, right? Why? That's not what it's for, right? So they would say, they would say objectively, not based on opinion, not based on anybody's particular, how they feel, what they want to say, whatever their mood is. If the natural law theorist guys are right, if you can really abstract the nature and the essence of a thing, in this case of the digestive system, it's no one's opinion whether you can eat dirt or not, right? They would say that just is an objective fact for all humanity, whether you like it or not. That just is the way it is. Why? Well, because that's just the nature of the thing. Does that make sense? So now, if they're right, if natural law theorists are right, and he says, like he said in regards to that particular sexual behavior, why would he say that that's the same? He would say what? You can look at, one, he would say, the sexual organs in and of themselves, right? And you observe what? The purpose, the end goal, the formal cause, right? The final cause, the teleological aspect of the thing, right? You see the purpose of the thing. Does that make sense? So, if the end goal or the purpose of the thing is to get to this particular position, which it, again, doesn't seem to be anyone's opinion, just the quote unquote nature or essence of the thing, then it would be wrong to what? Break what? The essence, or break the telos, the purpose of that thing in and of itself, if natural law theory is right. Now, so they would say something like this. They would say something like, all right, look, if the sexual act has a purpose, a telos, an end goal, if that is the end result of the sexual act, and one consistently and constantly stultifies, what do I mean by stultify? Stops or retards that, right? if the sexual act in itself is constantly stultified, retarded in that sense, bent back against what its purpose is, then someone is what? Doing something wrong in regard to the act itself, right? So they would say, all right, for instance, is the sexual act pleasurable? They would say, of course, right? But they would say, is that the end goal of the sexual act? They would say, no. They would say, so therefore would it be wrong to enjoy the pleasurable aspect of that? No. But they would say, you can't turn that into the end goal of the sexual act. Why? They would say, well, for the same reason that is eating pleasurable. Like there's certain meals, that are pleasurable, that we enjoy eating. Well, sure, right? But if you turned the pleasurable aspect of eating into the end goal of eating, they would say what? And they would say it's wrong. Why? Like you said, because you're stultifying the purpose of eating. So this is not controversial in eating. Why? Because we see, let's say that someone's a bulimic, or someone is, some sort of disorder where they love to enjoy the pleasurable aspect of food, but then they regurgitate it back up immediately, over and over and over. So they enjoy the pleasurable aspect, and they use food only for the pleasurable aspect, and then barf their food up over and over and over. What happens? The body starts to what? Would shut down. Why? They would say, because this, the telos, the end goal, the purpose, the final cause, is being stultified. And so they would say, that's why people say what's wrong. Bulimia is wrong, right? They would say something like bulimia is an incorrect behavior because of the obviousness of it stultifying the end goal and purpose of eating to begin with. That's what they would say, right? That's what the natural law theorists would say, probably among other things. Now, they would say it's not necessarily the pleasure that's wrong. It's the reversal of a secondary or peripheral or an accidental feature, what they would call an accidental feature of the thing with the purpose and end goal of the thing, right? Whatever that is. Now, they would say this in regards to the way you behave. This is how it's an ethical theory. They would say this is true in regards to how you behave, how you live your life. So they would say you've lived long enough, most people have lived long enough, that are at least, of our age here, where you've abstracted the nature and the essences of things around you. And you know right from wrong by having done that. How? How do you know right and wrong from having done that if they're right? Because part of abstracting the nature and essence of the thing is what? What comes along with that? That you're able to recognize what? Right, what it's made, quote unquote, to do. Does that make sense? So another example would be this. What's that supposed to be roughly? A triangle, right? How do you know that? It's a really crappy version of a triangle, but how did you know that's a triangle? Even if it's not even a perfect example of it, how did you know that? They would say what? That you've seen enough triangles to what? To capture or abstract or pull out the essence of triangularity, the whatness of, the triangleness of something. So even when you see something that's off, you still are what? Gauging it by what? You're still gauging that by what? By the essence of the thing. Does that make sense? By the nature of the thing, the way they're what? Supposed to what? Be. The way the thing is supposed to be. Right? And they would argue, and mathematicians, would agree with this part, that you can't say, well, I've seen perfect examples before, because theoretically you can't even construct a perfect triangle or perfect circle, you know, even with a little whatever graph it is. Because you just, we don't even need to get into all that. Go ahead, Andrew.
So what I was gonna say is, so by this logic, going by this, what you're saying, and you were talking about, you know, your digestive system,
Mhm.
all that, and homosexuality. So if it's something that's, like you said, retarding it or stopping it, that means that stuff like a woman using birth control, it's the same thought, right? Because then it's for, at that point, it's for the pleasure, it's not for.
Right, they would say, right, the natural law advocate, right, the natural law advocate would say if that's your entire purpose in using that, then that's wrong. In fact, that's why what specific religious group holds to natural law theory?
Mormons?
No, not Mormons.
Oh, Amish.
No. Well, they meant, right. And when I say holds to, I mean as in like an official position on this is the correct ethical theory. Right, Roman Catholics, because they say, what? Right, as a what? Right, so they would say that because if you do that, if your sole purpose in having sex is to stultify the end goal and enjoy it simply for the pleasure, then you're what? Just like the bulimic who's constantly throwing up their food. You've completely broken the purpose of the thing. Does that make sense? Now, you have some natural law advocates. Now, the Roman Catholic Church takes that position where any and every form of contraception is wrong. You've got some natural law advocates who would say, well, no, you can still do that so long as your sexual union still produces children. Does that make sense? Something like that. Just like you could enjoy a sucker or something, even though it gives no benefit, but you still don't barf up all your food all the time. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you've got some that say, that take the most strict stance possible, like the Roman Catholic Church. Then you've got other natural law advocates who would say, well, no, so long as the end goal is still being realized, is still being purposed.
So basically, that's like saying the Roman Catholics are like, you can only really have sex to reproduce. And other people are like, you can have sex for pleasure as long as you reproduce.
Well, no, the Roman Catholics would still say that you can have. No, this Roman Catholics would say. Right. So the Roman Catholics would still say, yeah, you can do that for pleasure, so long as you're not in the process retarding or stultifying the purpose of the thing. Just like they would say, you can enjoy your food, the pleasurable aspect of your food, make it as spicy, go across both aisles there, as you like, but don't barf it up, right? Is what they would say. It can be as pleasurable as you want it to be, don't barf it up, right? That's what the Roman Catholics would say. Now, again, like Andrew just said, yes, there would be other natural advocates would say, quote unquote, sometimes stultify the end purpose, so long as overall the nature of the union or whatever is still producing the end goal.
If you were like on the far, the strict radical side of it, I mean, that could go pretty far. Like,
in what sense? And I'll try to be fair. I mean, I'm not Roman Catholic, but I'll try to be fair to, their position.
I'm just trying to say, like, where's the line drawn? Okay, so
you're talking about in regards to like birth, you mean?
Yeah. Okay. As far as not necessarily birth control, but at that point, like, okay, so it's at that point, isn't it still for just pleasure though? If you don't use birth control, so like, let's say that they're not intentionally trying to have a kid. You get where I'm going with that?
Oh yeah, but they would say that's fine because they'd say that you're still allowing the process to go where it's quote unquote made to go. So if you have a kid, all right, right. If you right, that's exactly right. They would say if it happens, it happens. You're not trying to stultify the process. If you're in the sexual relationship, with your spouse or whatever, and you're doing it for the pleasurable aspect. So long as you're not stultifying the end goal, who cares? They would say. They wouldn't have any problem with that. Now, here's another controversial aspect. They would say that for other reasons, because things have a nature and essence to them, formal, final, cause, all these sorts of things, they would say, well, let's skip that one for now. Let's skip that. Let's skip that hot button for a moment.
Okay, so what about after, okay, so you don't really want to have a kid past your 40s.
Mhm.
After that, at that point, it's strictly pleasure, right?
Well, no, I mean, because they would say that and again, I'm trying to be fair to the Roman Catholic position. They would say that who's heard of natural family planning? Has anybody heard of that? Well, there's a natural family planning is that a woman can, to a very, just as reliably, quote unquote, as condoms, whatever the percentage of condoms work. If you practice natural family planning, is what they call it, a woman's ovulation period can be, it takes a month or so before they get to do it. Because I've known people that have done this before, natural family planning, to learn their cycle, so to speak. Well, so within that cycle, if you're disciplined about it and you know when your cycle is and when, all these sorts of things, then that's just as reliable to have the sexual relationship during that period of time. No, I've known people that went decades without having kids, and I'm not even Roman Catholic by any stretch of the word.
Not worth the risk.
But again, if the studies are right, the risk is no greater than condom use, right? So you can have sexual relationship within that period and have the same statistical average of what a condom would be. Now, again, like Piper said, is it possible that you would still have a kid? Is it possible?
I mean, it's
Absolutely.
possible, just not any of it.
Well, that's why they say that Roman Catholic Church would say that's still okay to use that, because you are not what?
You're not actually retarding.
You're not retarding the process by itself. You're not doing that. That's quote unquote natural in the sense of if your body does it, you don't control that, right? If your body is not ovulating or whatever at the particular moment and you have sexual, relationship, then you are not controlling that, right? You're not stultifying that or trying to retard or cut short the purpose of the thing. That's what they would say there. Now, again, that you'd have to be super disciplined with that and all kinds of other things, but
Once again, never leave it up to human error.
Kind of where you just draw the line.
well, no, I mean, they would say based on reason, just remember like Kant said, like whether you like it or not, if this produces a logical contradiction, he would say it's wrong. You can't just arbitrarily pick and choose. So the natural law theorists would say, right, same thing. If you're abstracting the nature or essence of a thing, you can't just say, well, this is the purpose of it. No, you know the purpose of it. Huh?
So the gold protocols are still there. So that's their difference between that and what they would say homosexuality, because there's no protocols whatsoever. It's not that.
Right. And I don't want to get super controversial here or super, I don't want to go into the gutter, so to speak. But, they would say if natural law theory is right, let's come over here.
They say a lot of-
If natural law theory is right, and you can abstract the nature and essence of a thing, this is what Plato, Socrates, this is what the classical philosophical position would say. They would say that the penis,
there was a
the
lot
end
more-
goal, the end purpose of the penis is not to be in an anus, is what they say. They would say the end goal, the purpose, the nature of an anus is not. They would say it's like barfing up food constantly.
Right.
So if they're right, that would be why they would say, for instance, that's how you know that that's wrong. So they'd say, it's wrong. Just like you don't get, a brick and just constantly, they would say that's like you're doing that. In fact, that's what one of their arguments is. They were like, this is like the man who bashes his head on the wall, not realizing the purpose of his head is not to be bashed on a wall. They would say, that's what you look like to us. That's what he would say. He would say, and this is what we talked about earlier, a couple of days ago. That's why they would say that our generation, specifically where we live now, is completely unreasonable. They would say your law, your quote unquote ethical law makes no sense whatsoever. It's completely against what they would say is what? Reason. They would say it goes against reason because you deny the most what?
Basic.
There you go. They would say you deny, you say they don't even exist. The most basic, intuitively obvious purposes and end goals and final causes and teleos of everything that you see on a daily basis. They would say you are completely unreasonable, illogical. And remember, one of the aspects of that, they would say that that's not even a particularly, well, they would say this full stop. They would say full stop that that's not a religiously owned or monopolized by a religion, right? Why would they say that? Why might they say that?
What would you repeat that?
That this natural law theory as a whole is not owned by or monopolized by a religious point of view. Why would they say that?
Because it's just
Religion.
yeah.
Right, because Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, those guys were what? Christians, right? Muslims, right?
No.
Jews, right?
No.
Hindus, right?
No.
No, they were none of those things, right? They were quote unquote ancient heathen pagan. Well, they wouldn't be considered heathens, but pagans, right? They would say that's just basic pagan philosophy that reaches a what? A logical or reasonable or rational what? Conclusion based on what they would say is sound philosophical principles, if they're right. Does that make sense? So they would say that that's not monopolized by religious claims. They'd say you could be completely irreligious and hold to that theory. Now, let me talk about a problem with natural law theory. And this is where we talked about piggybacking the other day, dovetailing. Now, like Kant's idea that morality and ethics was supposed to be reasonable, meaning that it wasn't supposed to be arbitrary, right? If you're going to get objective or absolute morality or whatever, if you're going to get that, and Kant, like Kant wanted to do, he wanted to do it through reason, right? Meaning it wasn't arbitrary and it wasn't just made up by somebody, that it was reasoned. Now, natural law theory wants to do that, right? But what was one of the problems with, among others, what was one of Kant's problems in that? It did seem to be reasonable, right? Right? It wasn't unreasonable, but it still had a problem with what? This right here. Moral obligation. What do I mean by that? Why ought I what? Why, right, why am I obligated to be rational? Right, why am I obligated to do this? Who am I obligated to? Right? Now, this is why, as we already kind of said, something like the Roman Catholic Church and others would say, they would say this is where divine command theory can dovetail on the back of, say, one of something like this. Why? Because they would say it solves what? What was the problem? What was the thing the other day? And it can solve this part. Right? Just like if divine command theory dovetails on, say, something like Kant's ethical theory. Does that make sense? You've got to find this metaphysical grounding somewhere. Now, the natural law advocate would say, well, wait a minute. We found the metaphysical grounding in the natures and essences themselves. Those are metaphysical. Well, okay, I'll grant that, but you still have to deal with this obligation, right? Moral obligation. For instance, am I obligated to what? Behave in accord with some abstract principle of an essence. So what? I don't care. What if I don't want to? I don't want to go. What do I care if I'm acting in accord with the nature of essence of a thing? Well, they might say, well, then bad results will happen. Because again, just like, well, say I want to drive my car on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. All right, you can, but objectively, bad things will happen to your car, right? So they would say, all right, well, you can do that, even if you don't want to be bound by the nature as something, but bad results will come because that you're breaking the purpose of the thing. Okay, well, all right. But if you want a more robust system, you're still going to have to find this obligation aspect, this other sense of grounding it in the meta-ethical sense. That's why a lot of natural law theorists have just will be fine with saying, all right, well, divine command theory in some way can dovetail on top of this, or they ground the natures and essences like Augustine did. Augustine tried to ground the natures and essences of things within the divine mind of God, right? So he'd say, all right, well, the natures and essences of things are created, instantiated in the world because of they exist in the divine mind of God himself, something like that. That's how Augustine would try to answer something like the metaphysical, the grounding problem. To oversimplify a little bit, but essentially that. Let's try to wrap this up. What do you think some of the appeals of this are, very quickly, of natural law theory? Just like all the other ethical theories, what might be a couple of the appeals? In one way, right? Because in how again, it's very difficult in one way, but simple. How is it simple in one way? Well, that would be duty. That would be Kant. How would this be simple? Kind of like the logical stuff we talked about previously. How you already what? Right. You're right. You know it. They would say you know this already. Right. They would say if you're honest, if you're intellectually honest, you know that this ain't gonna work doing this, right, or something like that.
Essentially saying you have to screw with something to screw it up.
There you go. They would say something like you intentionally have to. They might even say suppress what you know the purpose or end goal of things is to not know this, right? Because they would say, why? Just like with logical syllogisms, you're doing it already. Your mind is already abstracting. It's made to abstract, pull natures of, pull essences of, right? The only way you would get around that is to suppress that somehow, or be hit in the head with a bat or some kind of crazy thing, right? Now, what might be a difficulty? Or first, what might be another appeal of that? I mean, Piper hits probably the most obvious appeal, but what might be another appeal? No, that's Kant. That's duty. Yeah. What might be another appeal? I mean, obviously, if you're Roman Catholic, you're like, hey, my particular religious affiliation has got a well thought out ethical theory, right? What might be another appeal? What about one of the appeals of Kant? What was one of the big appeals of Kant's system? Well, it tries to give you an objective and absolute way that things are, right? It tries to give you real, true, objective morality, regardless of some guy's arbitrary what? Opinion, right? It tries to do that. It just tries to do that not only with quote unquote logic or rationality, but by what? A metaphysical commitment to what? Natures and essences and all those sorts of things. Meaning they could say this, they could say, all right, look, you can say that this is the perfect triangle, but it's no one's opinion that this one is better, right? Even though that's not perfect. Why? Because they say, you know, you've abstracted the nature and the essence of the thing. So when you see these, you know which is better or worse, right? Without having to see a perfect one, you already know which one's better, which one's worse, right? The same in regards to, right. This looks like one of those ghosts from Pac-Man.
You gotta kind of.
What did you do to the ghost?
Abstract.
So they would say, based on natures and essences, you know those things. You don't even have to go to philosophy class to know that kind of stuff, right? Right? They'd say you don't have to go to philosophy class to know any of this. They would say you just know it. Just like you didn't have to go to philosophy class to learn about syllogisms and logic. You just had to go for somebody to spell it out for you to find out what you were already doing. Right? That's what they would say. Now, again, one of the difficulties would be, all right, well, do they have an answer to this moral obligation kind of thing? Does that work? But the biggest difficulty is, and here's the big one, is what do you think modern philosophy denies? Modern era philosophy. What do you think it denies? This is the biggest objection. Because they grant all that. They'll say, yeah, man, yeah. If I grant this, then all of this makes sense. All of it. All of it makes sense. What does modern philosophy deny? They deny something exists. What do you think it is?
All of that.
What you just said.
We're close, and we'll end on this. What do they deny? They say there are no such things as what? Nope, not necessarily that. They try to say there's no such thing as what? A nature or an essence. They're made up. Completely 100% fabricated. But see, guys, can you see where this is going culturally?